Have you ever looked back and realized that one small moment changed your whole life? When I was a child, I lived through some tough times when the winter cold was biting and every meal was a struggle. But someone came into my life and gave me something I will never forget: kindness. Now, as an old man, I sit here remembering those days, and I want to tell you my story, a story of gratitude and never-ending kindness. My name is Ethan. It has been more than 70 years since I was a poor child, and sometimes I think back, if it weren't for Mrs. Thompson's help, would I have been able to stand firm against the challenges of life? My life has gone through many changes, but I still remember those difficult days, Mrs. Thompson's good years that completely changed my life and my family's. I was born and raised in a small town called Brookville in the northeastern United States. The winters there were long and cold. When I was 10 years old, winter came early and lasted longer than usual. The cold wind blew down from the mountains, making the air heavy, and in our house, even with the fire lit, it was cold to the bone. My father, William, was a skilled carpenter, but his work was unstable. We lived in a small house with an old tile roof and storm-damaged walls. My mother, Emma, was the only one who kept the family together. She looked after us, cooked, washed, and despite her poor health, always smiled and did everything she could to make sure the family did not lack. That winter, I remember, we barely had enough food. My mother never showed any signs of hunger, but I knew she was worried. Sometimes we went to bed without a proper dinner, and in her sleep, I would hear her sighing in the darkness. I still remember her sitting by the fire, looking at the flames, her eyes sad, but she never complained. When I was 12, my father had an accident at work. He was seriously injured and could not work for a long time. This made things even more difficult for my family. One afternoon, while I was helping my mother clean the house, there was a knock on the door. When my mother opened the door, an old woman with white hair and a kind face stood in the doorway. Her name was Mrs. Thompson, who lived across the street from us. Mrs. Thompson was not a wealthy woman, but she was always the first to lend a helping hand to a family in need in this neighborhood. She never asked for thanks, and she never left empty promises. It was just the little things she did, but we always felt the love and kindness in them. Once again, Mrs. Thompson came to my family's aid. She came to see my mother, carrying a large bag full of food: potatoes, carrots, rice, and some pork. "Your family must be having a hard time," she said. "I have some extra food that you can use to make a meal for your family." My mother said nothing, but her eyes lit up and her voice cracked. "Thank you so much," she said, her eyes brimming with emotion. Mrs. Thompson's kindness didn't stop there. She knew that this winter would be a big challenge for our family, so she brought us some extra little gifts: a warm blanket, a warm outfit for me and my brother. "It's just a little bit," she told my mother, "but I know you'll need it." As the days went by, I began to realize something important that I had never thought about. Kindness is never reciprocated immediately. But Mrs. Thompson taught me that helping others is not about receiving, but about sharing, about making a difference in someone's life. One afternoon in November that year, when I was old enough to understand what was going on around me, I sat down to write a letter to Mrs. Thompson. I was in my little room, looking out the window where the cold wind was still blowing. I remember every word of that letter, handwritten and full of emotion. "Dear Mrs. Thompson, I want to thank you for all that you have done for my family. Your help has given us hope in our most difficult times. You have not only brought us food and supplies, but also given us a belief in the goodness in this life. What you have done for my family will always be a deep memory in my heart. I promise that when I grow up, I will repay you by helping others as you have helped us." After writing the letter, I had no idea how much impact it would have on me and Mrs. Thompson. When she received the letter, she was deeply moved and said that I had made her very proud of me. But she simply said, "Just remember and follow through on what you promised. That's the most important thing." As the years passed, I gradually grew up and realized that life is not only about what we have, but also about what we give. After finishing high school, I started working at a store in town. The job did not pay much, but I always remembered my promise to Mrs. Thompson. I spent most of my income to help the needy people in the neighborhood. I participated in volunteer activities helping poor families like my family in the past. 10 years later, I have become a grown man. I got married and had a small family of my own. During that time, I moved to a big city to look for better job opportunities. But I never forgot my promise. I still participate in charity activities, help families in need, and I cannot forget the touching look on my mother's face when she received gifts from me for her family. And then one day, I received the sad news. Mrs. Thompson had passed away. When I heard the news, I rushed back to Brookville to attend her funeral. At the service, I stood by her grave and told myself that my life would always be filled with the memories of what she had done for my family and for others. Mrs. Thompson has always been a role model to me, not in terms of wealth or power, but in terms of kindness and sharing. After Mrs. Thompson passed away, I continued on my path. I started a small charity in the city helping poor families. I did projects to build houses for the homeless, provide food for those in need, and every time I looked into the eyes of the people I helped, I felt the warmth that Mrs. Thompson had brought to my family all those years ago. Mrs. Thompson taught me that kindness is a priceless gift. We never know how a small act can change someone's life, and I hope that throughout my life, I can continue to do that, repaying her by sharing what I have with those around me. For me, this story is not just a memory of the past, but a reminder that kindness and help are always valuable. And when we receive help, we must return the favor by helping others. There are gifts that never grow old, and kindness is one of them. When I was a child, Mrs. Thompson gave me more than just food, clothes, or a little warmth in the winter. She gave me hope. And now I continue that journey, helping children like me, little souls waiting for a light to guide them. Perhaps you have someone who has helped you in the past, a teacher, a neighbor, or just a kind stranger on the road. And maybe it is time for us to do the same for someone else, because sometimes a small act can change a life. Thank you for watching today's video. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next video. Let's continue this journey of sharing meaningful stories together. See you in the next video.